Do you have a final statement you'd like to make before the sentence of the court is carried out?
Yes. Tell my family I love them. Tell them that.
Auf den Gebieten des wirtschaftlichen Lebens. Hier wird kein Gesetz alles andere bestimmen. Das Volk lebt nicht für die Wirtschaft und die Wirtschaft existiert nicht für...
Body parts in the West Side apartment, and now they wonder if they've uncovered some kind of death factory. This was the scene earlier this morning. Police hired a private contractor to haul a refrigerator and a tank of acid out of the apartment.
Your Honor, it is over now. This has never been a case of trying.
Hi guys, welcome back to Truific Podcast. I'm your host Britt, and as you may know, I have released one episode. That episode's audio is insane. So I'm going to try to do a little bit of messing around with this one, and hopefully it'll sound a lot better for you guys. But I was out with COVID and the flu at the same time. My family got the flu. I had COVID 2 weeks prior, but for whatever reason, I still had it, and the symptoms were even worse because they were activated more so by getting the flu. So that was fun. Felt like death for about, I would say a month. So, anywho, I am back and we can get into this again. So, today I wanted to kind of talk about something that I was doing a little bit of research on, and at night I tend to just binge watch true crime. Honestly, I've binge watched true crime since I was about 13. And so I was looking over famous last words of death row inmates and came across something that was really, really interesting to me. In the United States, an estimated 3% of executions are botched. And these are statistics from 1890 to 2010 that I saw. So that's not even considering the ones that happened prior and after 2010. Murderers, criminals of all sorts on death row basically go in to say their final words, and then the executioner, as you know, flips the switch or drops the noose or injects them, and they still will not pass. As an executioner, I can't even imagine. This is probably their worst nightmare, because I would have to think in order to be an executioner, you would need to be partially psychotic. So I don't know. I don't know who signs up for those jobs or if it's something you're just put into. But either way, if your job is to kill someone very, very bad, and they don't die, if you are a superstitious person, I would imagine that being horrifying. I would be horrified of being haunted in the afterlife by them, so hell no. So the only way of execution that isn't botched by any means is the firing squad. And that's for obvious reasons, unless everyone on that squad has like zero aim and no more ammo, you're basically going to be done for the way that you were intended, and pretty quickly. In the cases of hanging, lethal injection, gas, In the electric chair, though, it's known that they aren't always 100% successful on first try. And these are some of those horror stories. On April 22nd, 1983, in Alabama, John Evans was put in the electric chair. After the first jolt of electricity, sparks and flames erupted from the electrode attached to his leg, and the electrode burst from the strap holding it in place and caught on fire. So smoke and sparks came out from under the hood on his head in the vicinity of Evans' left temple. 2 physicians entered the chamber then and found a heartbeat. So he was still alive. They then reattached the electrode that had burst to his leg, and then they applied another jolt of electricity, and this just resulted in basically cooking him more. But once again, the doctors found a heartbeat, and at this point, there was smoke and just the smell of burning flesh all throughout the room. Now, Evan's lawyer pleaded with them to kind of put a hold on it, stop, like this is basically torturing him at this point. But they ignored that plea, and the execution was continued with a third jolt of electricity, and the execution took 14 minutes and left Evan's body completely charred and smoldered. Now, I don't care what you've done. Me as a person, I feel like there are certain things that you just don't do to somebody, period, as a human being to another human being. And to put somebody through this much, like, I feel like they should have taken him out of the chair and picked an alternative that obviously was less heinous. This next occurrence was in 1983 on September 2nd. In Mississippi, Jimmy Lee Gray was meant to be put to death by asphyxiation, and they do this with gas. Now, officials had to clear the room about 8 minutes after they released the gas because basically he was gasping for air so badly that it was deeply disturbing and repulsing the witnesses to his execution. His attorney, Dennis Bosk of Montgomery, Alabama, actually criticized state officials for clearing the room when the inmate was still alive. They noted that the death penalty defense attorney, David Brooke, said that Jimmy Lee Gray died banging his head against a steel pole in the gas chamber while the reporters counted his moans. And this is not supposed to be a thing. Like, you are supposed to keep the prisoner at bay as they're going through this. You don't just leave them there to kind of suffer and put themselves through more, because if you're going through so much pain, like, I could only imagine you want it to stop. So he basically died from banging his head against a steel pole repetitively, and they said that reporters had counted his moans, and he let out 11 just gut-wrenching groans of pain. And later, it was actually revealed that the executioner, Barry Bruce, was intoxicated while administering this execution. On December 13th, 1988, in Texas, Raymond Landry was meant to go out with lethal injection. Now, for some reason, this is one of the most common ways that I saw executions botched. In this instance, he was pronounced dead 40 minutes. That's almost an hour after being strapped to the execution gurney. And it was 24 minutes after the drugs first started flowing into his arms. So, 2 minutes after the drugs were administered, the syringe came out of Landry's vein, and they put extremely deadly chemicals, a mixture of it, to do what it has to do to the body. And so when the syringe came out, it started spraying these chemicals across the room toward witnesses of the execution. Now, the curtain was separating the witnesses from the inmate, and they pulled the curtain after this happened, and it wasn't reopened for about 14 minutes while the execution team kind of reinserted the catheter back into the vein. Witnesses reported at least one groan, and a spokesman for the Texas Department of Correction, Charles Brown, said there was something of a delay in the execution because of what officials call a blowout. The syringe basically came out of the vein. If you've gone to the hospital and kind of been dehydrated, or you have a new nurse, that kind of happens. So the syringe came out of his vein, and they had to reinsert the catheter into the vein. On July 14th, 1989, in Alabama, Horace Franklin Duncans Jr. was meant to be electrocuted. Now, it took 2 jolts of electricity 9 minutes apart to complete this execution. After the first jolt failed to kill him, the captain of the prison guard opened the door to the witness room and was like, I think we got the jacks on wrong. Because the cables had been connected improperly, it was basically impossible to dispense sufficient current to cause the death. So they basically just extremely electrocuted this poor dude. And, yeah. They put the cables back on and then did a second jolt, and his death was pronounced 19 minutes after the first electric charge. And they basically admitted that post-execution at a conference that they regretted it a lot because it was their fault and complete human error that he was not killed in the proper amount of time that it was meant to take. On October 17th in 1990, in Virginia, Wilbert Lee Evans also was meant to go out by electrocution. Now, when Evans was hit with the first burst of electricity, blood spewed from the right side of the mask on Evans' face and drenched his shirt with blood. And then, obviously, as liquid does with electricity, you just heard this sizzling sound as blood dripped from his lips. He continued to moan before a second jolt of electricity was applied, and the autopsy actually concluded that Evans suffered a bloody nose after the voltage surge elevated his high blood pressure. On April 6, 1992, in Arizona, Donald Eugene Harding was meant to go out with asphyxiation, and they also do asphyxiation not only with gas, but also with cyanide tablets. Now, his death was not pronounced until 10.5 minutes after they dropped the cyanide tablets. So during the execution, Harding thrashed and he struggled violently against his restraints. Like, a journalist who witnessed the execution said that Harding's spasms and jerks lasted 6 minutes and 37 seconds. He even stated that this man was obviously suffering and this was a violent death, like an ugly event, and that we put animals to death more humanely than that. Another witness that was a reporter said that his death was extremely violent again, and he was in great pain, and that she had heard him gasp and moan and saw his body turn from red to purple. And reporters who witnessed this execution suffered from insomnia and illnesses for several weeks. Basically, 2 of them were in such a traumatic state that they were basically walking vegetables for multiple days after this occurred. That honestly just sounds traumatizing, not just to go through, but to also witness. On May 10th, 1994, in Illinois, you guys may know him, John Wayne Gacy, was meant to go out with lethal injection. Now, after the execution began, the lethal chemicals basically clogged together and solidified, and also clogged the IV tube that led into Gacy's arm, which stopped it from going any further, so they had to do something about it. The blinds covering the window through which witnesses watched the execution were drawn, and the execution team replaced the clogged tube with a new one. And then 10 minutes later, the blinds were then reopened and the execution process began again. It took 18 minutes to complete, and basically, anesthesiologists even said the problem with this execution was actually because prison officials who were conducting the execution were not taught IV 101. And if they had been taught IV 101, then this would not have occurred. On April 23rd, 1998, in Texas, Joseph Cannon was to go out the same way, lethal injection. It took 2 attempts to complete the execution, and after making his final statement, the execution process began. A vein in Cannon's arm collapsed, though, and the needle popped out. Now, seeing this, Cannon kind of laid back. He closed his eyes and basically told everyone witnessing, "It's come undone." Officials then pulled a curtain to block the view of the witnesses and reopened it 15 minutes later. They let Cannon, who was then crying, make a second final statement, and they resumed the execution process. December 13th, 2006, in Florida, Angel Diaz was to be killed by lethal injection. After the first injection was administered, Mr. Diaz continued to move and was squinting and grimacing as he tried to mouth words. A second dose was then administered, and 34 minutes passed before he was declared dead. At first, a spokesperson for the Florida Department of Corrections claimed that this was because Mr. Diaz had some sort of liver disease. But they did an autopsy, and the medical examiner that did the autopsy stated that his liver was undamaged, but that the IV catheters basically that had been inserted in both of his arms had gone through Mr. Diaz's veins and out the other side. So the deadly chemicals were actually going into his tissue rather than into his veins. So he went through a lot of fucking pain. Like a lot of pain. Because he just had not only... Normally, I'm assuming it hurts. It's a bunch of mixtures of lethal chemicals going into your bloodstream. But when you have things go into your tissue, it tends to make things feel a lot more. So that is extremely sad in this case. September 15th, 2009, in Ohio, Rommel Broom was meant to go out with lethal injection, and efforts to find a suitable vein and to execute Mr. Broom were terminated after more than 2 hours when the executioners were basically unable to find a usable vein in his arms or legs. During the failed efforts, Mr. Broom winced and grimaced with pain. After the first hour's lack of success on several occasions, Broom tried to help the executioners actually find a good vein. This is insane to me because, like, I have had to help nurses try and find a good vein for a blood draw. I can't imagine having to help an executioner find a good vein to kill me. So, he had to have been in a lot of pain just from the efforts that they did prior. So, at one point, he covered his face with both hands and was extremely, extremely upset, in a lot of pain. He was sobbing, his stomach was heaving. And finally, Ohio Governor Ted Strickland ordered the execution to stop, thankfully, and announced plans to attempt the execution basically in a week so that physicians could be consulted for advice on what the best way to execute him would be. The executioner blamed the problems on Mr. Broom's history of drug use, and Mr. Broom died in December 2020, actually, of COVID-19 that was contracted on Ohio's death row. December 8, 2016, in Alabama, Ronald Burt Smith Jr. was put in for lethal injection, and Smith was basically convicted of a murder of a convenience store clerk, and his jury actually at trial voted 7-5 to recommend a punishment of life imprisonment without parole. Alabama, however, requires neither unanimity or a majority jury vote before the trial judge can sentence a defendant to death. So Smith heaved, he gasped, coughed while struggling for breath for 13 minutes after the drugs were administered to him, and his death was pronounced 34 minutes after the execution began. He also clenched his fist and raised his head during the early part of the procedure, and Alabama actually used the controversial sedative, which is like a Valium-like drug. It's called midazolam. So they used midazolam in the execution. And yeah, that was a big no-no. So that did not go according to plan because it does not take 34 minutes for somebody to die after administering lethal drugs. On October 19, 2017, in Alabama, Tory McNabb was again meant to go out with lethal injection. It took 35 minutes for the lethal injection to end Mr. McNabb's life, and once again they used midazolam. Midazolam? I don't know. I could be completely killing the name of that, but I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to pronounce this correctly. So, anywho, this was in Alabama again, of course, and they administered the same drug to end Mr. McNabb's life as they did with Robert Smith Jr.'s life. And McNabb's attorney said that his movements during the middle of the execution included moving his arm, rolling his head back and forth after a consciousness check, and showed problems with the sedative used by the state. McNabb's family members were actually there, along with his attorneys who witnessed the execution. They said that he was still conscious during the lethal injection. And one of his relatives actually believed that he was going to wake up and completely feel everything and just come back in a burst of pain. So, yeah, Alabama did not do too great when it came to basically lethal injection, period. So, yeah, that is the really, really messed up misencounters when it came to executions. Now, there are quite a few places nowadays, because of these occurrences happening, where they have completely abolished, basically, executions. I'm pretty sure California is one of them. They do have life imprisonment, but they do not do the death penalty. So honestly, I myself feel like the death penalty, at least the way that some places do administer death to these inmates, it doesn't matter whether you're in there for weed or murder, you're still considered a human being. And I feel like even if you were to take a life in the most vile, disgusting way, it doesn't give another human being the right to put you, another human, through torture to take you out. I feel like, honestly, the worst thing that you can do to somebody that has committed a heinous crime is to lock them away in concrete for the rest of their lives until they are nothing more. But you should not, I guess, see it as a reasoning to potentially harm another human being to pay for them harming others. So that's just my thoughts on it. Let me know what you guys think. Do you guys think that executions and the death penalty is something that we should still be on board with? Or, do you think we need to kind of stick to one and make sure that it is done properly to the fullest extent? That's just, I don't know. This was a rough one. So, anywho, I hope you guys have a good night. And thank you for listening / watching. I really, really enjoyed making this one. And it's wild. Honestly, I didn't expect Alabama. I mean, of course, Alabama is completely sideways. But I didn't expect for a majority of these to come from the one state. So, yeah, should probably look into that. Anywho, you guys have a good night. And once again, thank you.